I'm always impressed by how polite Catholic audiences are when they listen to long monologues, which in my experience are almost always dull. Maybe it's because I have ADD and get easily bored. But the question and answer session afterwards, which is dialogue, is almost always interesting. And I figure it's because Catholics believe that they'll probably have to go through purgatory before they get to heaven. So I will inflict a purgatory on you first, a talk, 2 talks in fact, and then after you'll get a chance for the dialogue. I tell my students sometimes that my philosophy of teaching is that there's 3 philosophies of teaching. One is monologue, you lecture. The other is dialogue, you converse with the class. The best is trialogue. Here's the teacher, here's the students, and here's some great philosopher that I'm teaching, and he gets to talk the most and the first. And that's what God is, trialogue. He's a Trinity. So that's not only a good theology, but a good philosophy of teaching. I wrote a book called Socrates Meets Jesus, and I tried to actually imagine a fictional dialogue in which Socrates met Jesus, because I had written quite a few fictional dialogues in which Socrates met other philosophers, and I wondered what it would be like if he actually met Jesus. Well, you can't do that. I don't mean you shouldn't do that, I mean you can't do that. Nobody can write Jesus fiction that's convincing. The figure in the Gospels is just so real and so big that our imitations are just so ridiculous and so paltry that I just threw the book away. However, I did write a book called Socrates Meets Jesus, in which Socrates enrolls at Harvard Divinity School and confuses the teachers and the students there and thinks his way into Christianity. And that's a little more interesting than the talk I'm going to give today because it's sort of dramatic. But the first talk I'm going to give today is kind of philosophical and historical and impersonal, and you'll have to sit through it if you want to get to the second talk, which is much more personal, my conversion story. So here it is. But instead of just analyzing faith and reason abstractly, I want to tell a story of the wild and wonderful marriage between faith and reason. And since Jesus is the object of our faith, and since Socrates is the paradigmatic philosopher, reason meets faith is something like Socrates meets Jesus. The fundamental intellectual project of Christian culture is the marriage of faith and reason. This began with the merging of biblical Judeo-Christian culture and classical Greco-Roman culture, which are the 2 great traditions in the ancient world which have survived and have formed that civilization which used to be called Christendom and is now called simply Western civilization. The 2 most important facts about Western civilization are, first, that it is ours, and 2, that it is rapidly committing intellectual and spiritual suicide. The marriage of these 2 cultures was the marriage of 2 historically new ways of thinking called faith and reason. We usually forget how new these 2 roots of our civilization were in the ancient world. The 2 languages of these 2 cultures contained many words that expressed concepts that had never occurred to any human mind in the world before, concepts that simply did not exist in any other culture, and therefore words that did not exist in any other language. For instance, the word barach in Hebrew, which means to create something out of nothing. This is a feat impossible to nature, impossible to man, and impossible to all the pagan gods, but not impossible to the Hebrew God. Another radically new concept was the concept of sin, which meant not simply moral evil or unethical behavior, but breaking the uniquely intimate covenant relationship with God, that relationship that no other culture other than Jewish culture in the ancient world knew. And if you don't understand the intimacy of marriage, you don't understand the suicidal tragedy of divorce. Faith is like marriage to God, and sin is like divorce from God. Still another unique Hebrew concept was the revealed name of God, I am. An absolute name, not a relative name. And in Greek, we also have unique concepts like science and logic and definition and essence and nature and substance and accident, much more abstract concepts. The radical newness of these two cultures is revealed in two words, the word Gentiles and the word barbarians. The Jews and the Greeks were so distinctive that each of them had a single word for all other cultures. To the Jews, all men were either Jews or Gentiles. To the Greeks, all men were either Greeks or barbarians. There were only two kinds of people, not many. To the Greeks, the Jews were simply one unusual kind of barbarian. To the Jews, the Greeks were simply one unusual kind of Gentiles. And the single most life-changing and history-changing distinctiveness of these two cultures consisted in two new ways of thinking about everything. These two new ways of thinking changed history, and they were faith and reason. What were these two new ways of thinking? How were they so radically new? Well, what faith had meant for all Gentile religions was something private and mystical or esoteric, something unverifiable. Shamans and witch doctors had it, and then their authority percolated down to the people. But what faith meant for the Jews and for the Christians who learned from them was something quite different, something public, something available to everybody and demanded of everybody, and was expressed not in mystical experiences, but in words and deeds, the words of the prophets and the public miracles of salvation history. Judaism was a new kind of religion, a new kind of faith. An equally new kind of reason was discovered by the Greeks. What reason or wisdom had meant for all barbarian cultures was the purely practical wisdom that leaked down by osmosis from tradition and authority and was mediated by a few elitist authority figures, the seers. Just as faith had become public and egalitarian and objective in Israel, reason became that in Greece, public and egalitarian and objective. When Socrates, the world's first great philosopher, appeared on the scene and won every argument he ever engaged in because he clearly understood for the first time what logic was and how it had the authority to judge even the highest traditions of its culture, the gods of Homer and of Greek mythology, this Socrates appeared to his fellow Greeks as a new kind of man, and such a threatening one that he had to be executed. Now, any marriage between Gentile religions and barbarian philosophies would have been impossible. There was no common meeting point. Both were irrational, elitist, private, and subjective. But the marriage between Jewish religion and Greek philosophy was possible because both were rational, egalitarian, public, and objective. And both the Jewish religion and Greek philosophy affected the whole world. Unlike Gentile religions or barbarian wisdoms, all of which have died out, the Jewish religion influenced the world through Christianity, and Greek philosophy influenced the world through the Roman Empire. Judaism is not a missionary religion. It doesn't proselytize until the Messiah comes, but Christianity is. So paradoxically, the whole world learned about who the Jewish God was through Christian missionaries. Greek philosophy affected the whole world through Rome, which provided the body that carried the Greek mind everywhere after the Greek political body was absorbed into the omnivorous Roman stomach. Rome produced no important new philosophies, but it revered Greek philosophy, even after conquering the Greek Empire. Throughout the history of Rome, rich parents imported philosophers from Greece to educate their children. Now, just imagine a Martian sociologist with materialistic leanings studying the Earth in his flying saucer in the 6th century BC. He probably never would have predicted that 99% of the future of the West would depend on these two little postage stamp-sized civilizations, Israel and Greece. That should give us a clue as to how much we should trust our current prophets. Our first photo of this wedding is in the prologue of John's Gospel. Here we see the wedding night of the marriage and the conception of its embryo. For here we see the two becoming one. Both are called logos, a Greek word that has many meanings. The divine sperm is the logos of God, the word of God, the mind of God, the reason of God, the truth of God. The human egg is the logos of Greek philosophy. And the marriage was like an equation. The logos equals Jesus Christ. That's the E equals MC squared of religion. John identified the very center of classical culture, the logos, the ultimate truth sought by all the philosophers, the eternal truth, the meaning of all things. He identified that with the absolute center of Christian culture and the Christian religion, namely the concrete historical person of Jesus Christ, the logos incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, which had become this finite mortal man. And the Word became flesh. When John wrote that fateful equation, it was like Einstein's equation of matter with energy. And the energy that was released transformed the world even more than nuclear energy. Jesus equals the Logos. This was not the paganization of Christianity. It was the Christianization of Greek philosophy. Because man did not impregnate God, God impregnated man. That, by the way, is why the Christian God and the God of Judaism is never symbolized as she, only he, even though men and women are equally God's image. A second photo of this wedding we have in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts, where Paul, the great Christian missionary, goes to Athens and preaches to the Greek philosophers. He does this following the very footsteps of Socrates on Mars Hill, next to the Agora, where Socrates philosophized. And he begins his sermon by saying, as I was coming up this road, I saw very, very many altars. You have very many gods. You're so religious. He's being sarcastic, of course. These are all idols. But one of these altars, he said, I found particularly interesting. It was inscribed not to Zeus or Apollo, but to the unknown God. The God you are already worshiping in ignorance, I will now declare to you, he says. Now, Socrates was, in fact, a stonecutter, not a sculptor. That required special talent, and that was only for the rich, but a stonecutter was a poor man's job. And stonecutters did things like cutting simple altars, as long as they didn't have a statue on them. And Socrates, indeed, did worship a single unknown God. That was why he was executed. He didn't believe in the gods of the state. So that may have been Socrates' own altar and own inscription. So that may have been literally the apostle of Christ meeting the disciples of Socrates. And he says an astonishing thing. The God you already worship, the Greek means not just a one-shot deal, but habitually. The God that some of you are already worshiping, namely the God of Socrates, is the God that I will now tell you about. You worship him in ignorance. And then he reveals the Bible to him. As the incarnation is an extension of God himself into history, all of Christian culture is an extension of the incarnation. Philosophy is an essential part of that, because philosophy reflects on it and on its meaning and seeks to give its definition and its rational defense. Many great minds in Christian history contributed to this enterprise, but the greatest of them all, according to the definitive teaching of the Church herself, the greatest Catholic theologian of all time, as articulated by the Council of Trent and almost every single pope, at least since Leo XIII, is St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas answers almost every question by making a distinction. So, my next point after this long historical introduction is the distinction between three aspects of the faith-reason relationship. The first aspect takes faith and reason to be timeless objective truths. So faith means all the truths knowable by faith, and reason means all the truths knowable by reason. That's the aspect St. Thomas himself dealt with. A second aspect of faith and reason might be psychological acts, acts of the human soul. That's the more typically modern meaning of faith and reason. Faith here involves both personal belief and personal trust. And it's the trust that's the specifically religious faith. You don't die for an opinion, you die for a commitment. And that kind of faith saves us because it allows God to impregnate our souls with his divine life. God will not rape us. He will only seduce us. We have to invite him in. When the most important thing any angel ever did in the history of the world was done, when the angel Gabriel went to Mary, he had to ask permission in the name of God. Would you please consent to be the mother of God? And if she had said no, none of us would have any hope of heaven. Well, the other aspect of faith, namely the intellectual aspect, is necessary, but not sufficient. It's necessary because we have to know who we believe in, but it's not sufficient because, as James says, the devils also believe, but shake with fear. Now, there's a third aspect of faith and reason. You can take these things to be human historical entities, like Adam and Eve. I think their names refer not only to historical individuals, our first parents, but also to all mankind throughout history. This is why St. Paul does not say that we are punished for another man's sin, but that we all sinned in Adam. Okay, when St. Thomas Aquinas philosophizes about faith and reason, he asks the first question: what's the relationship between the truths known by each way of knowing? He then asks the question how these two kinds of truths, or sets of true propositions, are related to each other. And that's an easy question to answer, because it's a happy, clean, bright question. And he gives an easy, happy, clean, and bright answer to it. It's a typically simple and objective question, typical of the pre-modern mind, which is like the mind of a child who keeps asking, what's that, what's that, what's that? The answer is, first of all, that there can never be any contradiction between any truth known by faith and any truth known by reason, because God is the author of both, and God never contradicts himself. The medieval philosophers loved to say that God wrote two books, Scripture and Nature, or natural reason. And both, rightly interpreted, are true. And truth never contradicts truth. Only error contradicts truth. Therefore, there has never been, and there can never be, any real contradiction between any divinely revealed Christian doctrine and any truth discovered by human reason, by science, by history, by philosophy, by common sense. All apparent contradictions between the two are based on mistakes. And those mistakes can always, in principle, be unmasked and corrected by human reason, because they are errors of reason. Thus, the supposed conflict between science and religion has about as much real existence as zombies. It's a myth. A second part of St. Thomas's answer is that these two sets of truths are partly independent, that they overlap partly, so that some of the truths of faith, like the Trinity, cannot, in principle, be discovered or understood or proved by unaided human reason. But other truths of the faith, like the existence of God or the unity of God or the goodness of God, can. And that some of the truths of reason, like most of the discoveries of the natural sciences, are not part of divine revelation, but that others, like the order of the universe and the uniqueness of human thought, do form part of divine revelation. So there are three kinds of truths: truths knowable by faith alone, truths knowable by reason alone, and truths knowable both by faith and by reason. And that's a very reasonable answer. It's one of only 5 possibilities. I'll give you a little logic lesson here. You can fall asleep if you like. I won't be insulted. Logically, there are only 5 possible answers to any question about the relationship between any two things or classes of things. The two can be separate, identical. The second can be assimilated to the first can be assimilated to the second, or they can partly overlap. And all 4 of the other logical possibilities here, all 4 alternatives to St. Thomas's overlapping answer, are unreasonable. The total separation of the two denies the existence of any middle category, any meeting between faith and reason. The total identity of the two denies the independence of either of the two. The total subordination of faith to reason denies any independence to faith, and the total subordination of reason to faith denies any independence to reason. Now, that's a very short summary of St. Thomas's answer to the question of the relationship between faith and reason. As far as I know, there is no better answer to that question as he conceived it. But there are other ways to conceive the question. The second way I mentioned of conceiving the question is to mean by the relationship between faith and reason the lived relationship between the exercised act of faith and exercised acts of reason within the personal psychology of an individual. Now, that's a much less easy question to answer because it's a much less simple, happy, bright, and clean question. It's complex and problematic and dark and messy and relative to different individuals. It's a question for psychologists more than philosophers. It's a typically modern question because the typically modern mind is much more interested in the subjective than the objective, and it tends to be relativistic and individualistic. It's like the mind of a teenager who doesn't ask so much, what's that, as who am I? You know, why don't people love me? Do I have warts? Am I ugly? What am I going to do with my life? That's the typical teenage question. We're all teenagers today. But since I am no longer a teenager, I will not delve into that aspect of the question. But I will delve into a third aspect. The third thing we could mean when we ask about the relationship between faith and reason, and that's what I want to explore for the rest of this talk.